What does an autonomous car have to do with the translation industry? Maybe very little, maybe a lot. Stick around and find out. My name is Gabriel Fairman. I'm the founder and CEO of BureauWorks, and today I'm going to dissect where the similarities and the differences are between the self-driving car industry and the translation industry lie. A little bit on the background of this video and how it came about. I began to notice a very large number of cars over the years in San Francisco driven by Waymo, self-driving cars. And at first I just thought this was kind of like a science experiment, but the numbers got bigger and bigger and I began to take it a lot more seriously. And one article I was reading said that by around September last year, for instance, Waymos were delivering approximately 143,000 rides per month in the city of San Francisco alone. 143,000. That's a very big number of self-driving trips. And the first thing that I find very interesting about this is that for people who are not in San Francisco or the very few cities in which Waymo operates, the idea of a self-driving car actually operating may seem a little bit far-fetched, right? Sure, different vehicles have their own full self-driving capabilities, but here we're talking about a car that is operating 100% autonomously. It stops at the right place, it picks up a passenger, it takes it to their destination. The app is able to bill the passenger for that, and it's fairly seamless. And when you look at the statistics around data and safety, it's relatively safe. At least the data that I see published suggests that it's a lot safer than a human driver would be, both from a personal damage perspective and a property damage perspective. But the thing is, with a self-driving car, you're having a situation where you can go from beginning to end with zero human intervention. Whereas in the translation industry, even though you can do that in many cases, there's still the case for human intervention in certain cases, whether it's for liability reasons, whether it's for creativity reasons. There is still room in this high-tech model for human output management. So that's the first big difference, right? In autonomous vehicles, you have a scenario where it's possible to have zero human output management, at least that's the goal. Whereas with translations, it remains to be seen, but I definitely see a scenario where human output management still has its value. But when we take a step back and we look at this autonomous vehicle thing, the first thing that really strikes me is that if you asked me 20 years ago, it would have seemed a little bit like a sci-fi kind of concept. And it's being brewed in a very local way, but in a very clear exponential way. If you take a look at the growth chart of rides per month of a company like Waymo, for instance, you'll see a very beautiful, nice exponential J-shaped curve, which suggests just its potential, right? What holds back the growth of Waymo? A few different things. Number one, the cars are still relatively expensive. Every single Waymo is a retrofitted Jaguar F-Pace car, and they cost around $180,000 based on my research. So that's an expensive figure, right? To put $180,000 on the road. If you compare it to an Uber model or Lyft model where the driver is self-financing the car and they have zero cost to put a vehicle on the road, you can see that there's a pretty big gap, right? $180K to put a vehicle on the road versus zero. The second thing that holds these cars back are regulatory concerns, right? Whether it's pushback from cab driver associations, whether it's other kinds of driving associations, whether it's legal pushbacks, concerns from insurance companies. There are a lot of different parts of the economy that are going to be impacted by this and heavily push back on its growth. There's also just the resistance to change and the resistance of people to embracing this. So if you take a look at a Waymo, for instance, for legal reasons, they still have a steering wheel and they have brakes and pedals in the car. But the fact is that it's only for legal reasons. They could be entirely without them. They're not there for any given reason other than the legal reasons. So the first thing that I want to make clear is that there are no technological holdups in the Waymo solution, right? In theory, from a technological perspective, it would be perfectly fine to scale that solution. It's proven to be safety validated in a city like San Francisco. In theory, you could expand that model into different other cities around the States, into different cities around the country, into different cities around the world, there really is no limit to the expansion from a technical perspective. The limits are much more around economical limitations and as well around the legal implications. And I find that very interesting to think that there's this tech that's brewing, and it's been brewing since 2009, at least for Google, right? That's when they first launched their autonomous driving concept. It's been brewing there, and it's been collecting like a little lab. It's collecting in this lab like this little petri dish where they're like slowly improving the model, slowly making it safer, slowly making it more economically feasible, slowly making the public get used to it, slowly tweaking their marketing. And eventually they're going to get to a place where the acceptance is going to be bigger than the resistance. And this thing is just going to grow very rapidly. And if you think about it, for different kinds of situations that were previously unheard of, things like Uber, things like Google, things like Amazon, those are technologies that in their early days, they were very, there was a lot of resistance to them. What? You're buying something online? How does that work? What do you mean you're not actually paying a cab driver using an app? How does that work? So these things all had their element of weirdness at the beginning, and they are gradually normalized and eventually become the norm, the standard, right? And I think if you're living in a city like San Francisco and you're witnessing this, it becomes pretty easy to see that this is happening and maybe to get ready for this. For instance, I've already talked to a few Uber drivers and Lyft drivers who are already thinking ahead 5 years from now, thinking, what are they going to do once they don't have drivers to transport anymore? So they're seeing this thing coming, and they're seeing it early when this thing is still moving slowly. The probability based on tech adoption is that as self-driving cars pick up, as the legislation eases, as the economics become more feasible, it's not just that the curve is going to become exponential, but the speed of adoption is also going to become exponential, which gives you a lot less time to react. So that's the first really big concept that I want to put out here today. If the longer you take to react to one of these disruptive forces, the less time that you're going to have to react, not just because you've waited longer, but because it's already moving a lot faster by the time you react to that. If we make the parallel to the translation world, we've already seen machine translation, at least over the past 30, 40 years, developing in our space. Initially seen more as something interesting, sometimes funny, sometimes embarrassing, slowly gaining traction. And now machine translation is definitely something that people can take seriously. People can question how well it works in certain contexts or with certain kinds of things, but it's definitely a force to be reckoned with, right? Machine translation isn't anymore something that you can simply dismiss as ludicrous or whimsical. And similarly, with translations, with machine translation, you see a lot of translators who resist this idea. And they're like either focusing on memes, focusing on exceptions, certain situations where they can claim that the machine translation doesn't perform as well as them and that they're fine without them. Now you have other groups of translators who are saying, no, how can I leverage that into my workflow? How can I become better, more productive? How can I integrate that into how I currently work? There is no parallel for that in the self-driving car, right? In the self-driving car, it's either self-driving or driver assisted. In the translation space, we're working with a little bit more shades where you can have a scenario where it is fully translator assisted. And what does the translator do? The translator validates human output. The translator can validate this human output either because they are a subject matter expert or because they are a communication expert. So either they're a copywriter or someone who can really express ideas in a very refined way, better than machine translation or any model could, or they're a subject matter expert. But the clear thing, if you think, again, drawing these parallels and going back and forth, if you look at autonomous cars, it's really clear to see just how deep the disruptive force of these vehicles can be, right? So right now, we're already talking in San Francisco about approximately 143,000 trips per month. If you think that the average American spends about 13,500 miles per year driving, and if you think that the average driving speed at urban areas is around 30 miles, while in rural areas it's around 50 miles per hour. A common estimate is that Americans spend about 293 hours per year driving. That's roughly 12 full days behind the wheel annually, right? So imagine from an economic perspective, if instead of producing the GDP within 365 days, you could now produce the GDP with 377 days. those 12 extra days will result in greater economic activity, either because people have more time to buy things, people have more time to rest, people have more time to think about things. That time is given back to the economy, right? And what's interesting about this effect is you're not just, sure, if you think about it from a very isolated perspective, you have that initial disruption, which is the people who are driving those cars as professional drivers, they will be displaced. They will be no longer needed as this technology grows. While that's definitely a very harsh and negative impact for those drivers, it's also from an economic perspective, it's not necessarily that jobs are being erased. You're actually creating a possibility for even greater productivity through this disruption. Again, I don't want to dismiss just how painful and hard it could be, the loss of income, the loss of purpose, the loss of livelihood for those drivers. So those are two very different things. One is the individual subjective experience, which is terrible. The other one is the overall key economic impact of that initiative. Similarly, in translation, you have a kind of conundrum that is reflective of this situation. So for an individual translator, for instance, it's possible that they will experience some loss in income, some loss in purpose, some loss in livelihood. Again, I don't say all loss because the model, in my opinion, is different. We're not talking about all or nothing. I would say that the level of loss that is going to be experienced is directly proportional to the level of adjustment and adaptation that they're able to take with this change. So if they're able to adjust, for instance, and really incorporate the best of machine translation and models into their workflows, into their livelihoods, chances are that they're going to excel, and chances are that their livelihood is actually going to be better. Their incomes are going to be improved. Whereas if they resist, if they refuse to work with this technology, it's going to be very hard to compete. I mean, how is a human working with, for instance, a word processor going to compare with a human who's really able to leverage the best out of large language models and machine translation? Unless assuming that both of them have similar levels of capability, they can't compete, right? One is completely going to outperform the other. So the key thing I just want to stress is that even in that scenario where you do have some level of loss, you're still opening up huge economic potential, because as translations become less expensive and more ubiquitous, that means that a lot more content that could be translated and isn't translated due to economic reasons, either because it's too expensive, too complicated, that will get translated. So language will become a thing of accessibility. So think about it from let's do the reverse analogy. Right now, let's say an average cab ride is $20, right? $20 is a lot of money. For $20, maybe I'm going to take the public transport. I don't want to spend $20 on a ride. Maybe I'm going to walk. It's just too expensive for me. Now, let's say we get these autonomous cab rides down to $2. Maybe now they're even less expensive than public transit. And again, I don't want to get into an ideology of public transit versus private transit here. I'm just talking about from an economic perspective. All of a sudden, you've made these rides incredibly accessible. From an economic perspective, you've democratized these rides. You've made them incredibly accessible. Similarly, in translation, if you make translations less expensive, all of a sudden, people can translate into more languages that were previously not possible. People can think about different markets that they wanted to expand, and people can, all of a sudden, the norm is that you should have your website translated into 40, 45 languages, which means a lot more content is going to be translated. I don't have any kind of solid number on this, but if I had to estimate, based on the overall content that is available in the world, I would guess that a very small percentage of that content actually does get translated. Maybe 5%, maybe 10%. Again, I don't have any actual numbers, but translation is a very expensive thing. You need the actual human effort that is required to translate that. You need the systems, you need the infrastructure, you need the architecture, you need the know-how. It's a very complicated thing. It's a very expensive thing to get something translated, and sustainably so, and scalably so. It becomes very complicated. As these things become simpler, the tendency is that translation is going to become a much more widespread and common thing, which means that even though the per word rate or per hour rate will either go down or the productivity will go up. Doesn't really matter eventually. In the end, what it means is that people will have to produce a lot more for a lot less. That's just the way that this vector is heading in. That it will open the door for so much more work and also for much higher standards of what translation means, right? Again, let's look at autonomous cars. Autonomous cars will change the perspective of safety driving. Right now, Every once in a while, you get a drunk driver. Every once in a while, you get someone who's incapacitated, who makes a flawless, fatal mistake. In theory, as autonomous cars continue to evolve, these things will be less common than they are with humans, which means that the bar for safety is going to go up. As the bar for safety is going to go up, that's going to disrupt all kinds of tangential industries, such as insurance industries, such as medical industries, paramedics, because there's an entire industry that is built around the inefficiencies and ineffectiveness of human-led driving. Similarly with translators, there's so much more work that could be done to text that's not done just because it's too expensive, right? Maybe the translation is actually just the first draft of many other drafts. Maybe right now, let's say transcreation is considered something very expensive done for just small bits of content here or there. Maybe transcreation is going to become something a lot more ubiquitous, a lot more widespread. So the picture that I'm trying to paint is that from a systemic perspective, whatever happens with autonomous vehicles is something a lot more complicated to understand than simply the fact that artificial intelligence is replacing human effort, right? There's an entire impact in a very large ecosystem with tremendous repercussions. Same thing with human translators. It's not that artificial intelligence is necessarily wiping out human translators. It's definitely changing them and forcing people to change how they face their profession. The disruption goes a lot deeper, right? It changes the nature of content. It changes the nature of expectations of readers. In the case of car riders, changes the expectation of car riders, right? Let's say you get into a car, it becomes a very predictable experience because you're always being driven by the same algorithm. And as you have more and more autonomous vehicles on the road, it even becomes even more predictable. So eventually you get into a turning point where it's incredibly predictable to jump in an autonomous car compared to a human-led driver. Now, with translations, the key thing that I want to emphasize is that there is this stark difference, right? In an autonomous scenario, you have a full replacement. In language, my opinion, because language is something about identity, because language is something very intimate for us, I have my doubts whether or not it's just going to be a thing of efficiency. Even if we're at language singularity, I still believe humans are going to be there to, at the very least, watch over things, change things, influence things. It's text. It's something cultural. It's something that's, like I said, I don't think it's something that we're just going to delegate to machines, even if they can do it from a conceptual perspective just as well or better than any given human. But the key learning that I want to put out there is that when you look at even in the harshest scenario, right, if you look at an autonomous car replacing a human driver, there's still so many things that can be done. All of these other jobs are going to be freed up for humans, for instance, who will still need to be driving paramedic cars, who still will need to be doing food delivery services, who still will be needing to perform maintenance on this whole new fleet of cars. We're still going to be maybe performing hybrid assisted driving for either senior citizens or people with disabilities who need some kind of assistance getting in and out of the vehicle. So, and we can go on and on. The examples for how they can reinvent themselves isn't something that's trivial, right? It's very hard, very complicated from an individual perspective. But if you look at it from a systemic perspective, it's fairly possible to find a new place in this restructured kind of society. Same thing with translators. You don't have to go very far to think about all of the different opportunities that will still exist for a professionally trained linguist. Like I said, maybe they're going to become a validator. Maybe they're going to focus more on terminology. Maybe they're going to become an end user experience manager. Maybe they're going to become focused on copywriting and creativity. There's still going to be immense room because it's not that the bar shifts in an absolute space. The bar is shifting in a relative space that's shifting along with it. And that's maybe the most important part of what I'm communicating today, right? The space is shifting along with the bar. So instead of a translator just looking at this and thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be wiped out, I think a more accurate statement would be, oh my God, I'm going to be forced to change. And changing can be very hard, can be traumatic, especially if you resist it. But the key statement here is being forced to change as opposed to being wiped out. And when you look at the autonomous car and you look at the market that represents, what kind of indent that would make in the overall global economy and GDP, it actually seems kind of unavoidable that we're going to go in that direction. Maybe it's going to take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I don't know how long it's going to take, but that the overall direction that we're going to take as a society is towards autonomous driving, to me, seems pretty clear. Similarly, with translations, it's pretty clear to me that a very large amount of the translations will become autonomous-led in the next few years. But you still have all this space that is required to manage these translations, to have governance over these translations, to imbue these translations with your brand terminology, with your identity. And these aren't just simple things, right? These are things that require very fine human output management, whether it's tweaking prompts, whether it's reading text, whether it's doing both, whether it's working in an interactive way. But there is a lot of work that still is required, even in the event of a full singularity event, right? The singularity event would be in the moment in time in which machines are able to meet or exceed what humans are able to do in that same field, right? So they're able to meet and exceed what a professional translator would be able to do in any given translations that they would perform. So when we take a look at this overall picture, what we see is, there are things that are taking place that we don't necessarily see, and those things, they take their time to reach fruition. But once they do, they reach fruition with such speed that they become unstoppable. What can we do? We can be early adopters. We can look at this and we can react before they take on this unstoppable speed. We can be prepared, right? If this wave hits us with unstoppable speed and we're prepared, it's a lot better than being unprepared. So that's number one. Number two is flexibility, right? If we realize that these things are going to hit us and they will require a certain degree of flexibility from us, and we've been practicing this flexibility on a daily basis, chances are that by the time we really need to change, we've already have changed. It won't be necessarily a surprise. Now, on the other hand, if we become even more rigid, if we become more tense about it, chances are that we won't be able to react when we need to react. So for me, the really mind-blowing concept of all of this is realizing that beyond my little microcosm, beyond my little world, there are people working day in, day out to disrupt exactly what it is that I do. Because what it is that I do has value, and if it can be disrupted, it will be disrupted. Whether now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I do emphasize that being disrupted doesn't mean being wiped out. I think it's a matter of how we face that disruption. We could face it as a threat, we could face it as an enemy, or we could face it as an inevitable direction of our technological society. And if we do that, I think it's a much more constructive way of facing this. I think that we can do a lot more about it. We can become a lot more conscious about it. We can talk about it. We can think about it. And overall, we can help each other through what is inevitably a very complex transition that I believe we have ahead of us. But I would love to know your thoughts. What do you think is going on? Am I crazy? Do autonomous trucks have anything to do with translation? Let me know your thoughts in the video below. Until next time, bye-bye.